Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and this week we welcome Texas Impact's Advocacy Director Joshua Houston for a conversation about the recent midterm elections in Texas and how it impacts the upcoming Texas Legislative session. So, Josh, welcome to the program.
Hey, Scott. Good to be back.
Hey, man, there's been a lot happen since you were last on the podcast. I feel like we need to catch up. The Astros won the World Series. That was exciting.
Whoop.
Twitter was bought.
It was.
Yeah, foreign affairs are heating
up.
How
about that center fielder and that catch on that in that World Series was pretty amazing.
That was, and I feel really good for Dusty Baker. That just really made my heart sing.
Yeah, I like him a lot.
I also have to... We'll also talk about this soon, but we have a lot of staff over in Egypt right now. And most importantly, maybe for some who are listening, the U16 ladies Huntsville Eclipse soccer team won their league championship and are going to the fall playoffs. I told them I'd give them a shout out. So there's a lot going on. Josh, what do you think we should talk about today?
Well, I don't know. UT women's basketball is back. So, I mean, they're in the Bahamas right now. And my daughter and I love to attend those games. She likes them a whole lot. We got season tickets this year.
I do know you're a big fan of UT women's basketball, as am I. Go Rory Harmon. Who's injured right now, I think.
Yeah.
But the UT men's basketball team had a big win in the CBS poll. They're up to number 1. So basketball is rocking in Austin right now.
It is.
We'll have to turn this into a sports podcast one day, but I'm guessing that people are tuning in today not to hear our takes on UT basketball, but the recent elections. Been a lot of coverage in all of your news sources, but people tune in to hear you talk, Josh, about Texas elections. And I know coming in, the general take from you and many other observers in Texas was that the legislative races would not be as exciting this time because we're coming out of a redistricting cycle and most of the seats were safe. Is that my recollection of your take pre-election?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's always, reporters are busy people and they end up reporting and kind of parroting whatever the partisan folks gave them. And so, it's not that it's wrong. It's that it's just kind of comes from that perspective. There were no surprises, frankly, in how the election came out. The voters of Texas very much said, yeah, we're good with the status quo. And that shows up in the data. The legislative districts, as you said, performed exactly as they were designed to perform. There were no surprises there. I think there was a Senate district that was drawn to be Republican, where the Democrat was drawn into an unwinnable district, and it flipped as expected. And then there was one swing district, and that was drawn to be a swing district, and it went. And so it's going to be the balance of power is off 1 out of 150 House seats. Very, very little change, and just as expected. And then the statewides came out the same way, too, where nobody really expected major change there. The only question in the election was really about the margins.
Yeah, so talk to us about the statewides. I know you were watching the margins and had kind of double digits as a marker that you were looking at. Any observations from those statewide races?
Yeah, that's right. That was the big question: is would it be a single-digit race? That's because when you look at what's considered a swing district or a swing race, or to make a state, even considered to be purple, that's when, and this is generous, is that it's 10% or less. So less than 10% really. It needs to be in the single digits for percentages. So 55-45, less than 55-45, and the difference of the margin of victory is considered to be swing. And it was an 11% race between Governor Abbott and Congressman O'Rourke. And when you look it up and down the ballot a little bit, there is some crossover potential. It has been pretty stable since 2018, where there's about 6% of the state that will vote for a more traditional Republican and can discern the difference between the more extreme Republicans from the traditional Republicans. That electorate is about 6% of the electorate. So you see this with Comptroller Hager winning by 16% and Lieutenant Governor Patrick winning by 10%. But the bottom line is if you're a Republican in Texas, regardless of what flavor, you feel pretty good about how that came out. It was a very comfortable margin of victory. And if you're a Democrat in Texas, you very much feel like that your party underperformed. I think expectations were that this would be a single-digit race. In 2018, you had Congressman O'Rourke take Senator Cruz to 2.5%. And so I think the range was really somewhere between 2.5 and 9.9 in people's expectations, and that just didn't happen. That just didn't happen.
You've spent the last week or so post-election really diving in on the data. Anything you notice about why that might be different between 2018 and 2022?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. So this really quirky thing came up that I noticed, having kind of watched this stuff for, more than a decade now. If you go back to 2010, 2014, both were very big wave years for Republicans, and you saw Republicans pick up seats in the legislature. Conversely, you have, 2016, 2018, where, Democrats really narrowed the margins statewide, and you saw Democrats pick up seats in the legislature. And that didn't happen at all. I mean, there was a double-digit margin of victory for the statewides, and zero change whatsoever in the legislative races, and that was weird. And so then you have to ask yourself, why? And the answer, as it turned out, the answer was turnout. Was it high? Was it low? Well, not really either. It was actually relatively high, but really in between your two outliers. And it is kind of interesting that the lowest turnout in this kind of century would be the 2014 midterm, where about 25% of the state's voting age population participated. Conversely, the high end of that range is 42%. That was in 2018. And it was 37% this time around. And so that's where you have to say, well, what happened? Why is it the legislature was so stable, but the statewides really went for Republicans? And the only way that makes any sense is if you look at geography and you break it down by county and you look at which counties turned out. And so when you compare it to 2018, and if you take 2018 as your comparison year, the 5 urban counties, you look at the percentage of registered voters is the number that I'm using. You look at the percentage of registered voters that turned out, and the urban counties were down around 10% on average, give or take, depending on the county. But those 5, were down 10%. If you look at the kind of middle population 25 suburban counties, it was down, 7 to 8%, kind of in that ballpark. But then if you look at the rural counties, the couple hundred rural counties that are still left, they turned out very much like they did in 2018. There was not much drop-off. Some counties were 0% and in the range of, not really any greater than 4%. So it's kind of a 0 to 4% range, which tells you that the rural counties were enthusiastic to vote and voted very much like they did in 2018. But the urban counties, for whatever reason, sat it out. And we're not as enthusiastic about voting as they were in 2018. And that's the difference in the statewide races, because the urban counties in Texas are breaking 65-35 for Democrats. The rural counties in Texas break 75-25 for Republicans. And then suburbia is kind of a 50-50 in that ballpark. And it really varies 52-48 depending on the year. And between the parties, it can swing in that ballpark of 52-48, but it's roughly a 50-50 area of the state. So if you look at the counties that turned out, that lack of urban turnout really explains the difference in the statewide races, because and what it also tells you is that nobody was really persuaded. Right. Most voters have made up their mind several years ago. And this kind of 65-35 in the urban areas, 75-25 in the rural areas, 75 for Republicans in the rural areas, 65 for Democrats in the urban areas. This has been pretty stable, when you look at those counties. And so really it just comes down to who's enthusiastic to turn out.
Yeah, and the thing I love about you, Josh Houston, is you are so careful with your words. I appreciate the top line takeaway that turnout in rural areas was flat or down slightly, but a lot of folks stayed home in urban areas from 2018 to now. But you said that that turnout was relatively high, and I appreciate the word relatively that you put in there. But at the end of the day, 9.6 million registered voters stayed at home. And
that's
estimated
right.
11 million voters who could be the voting age population, 11 million people stayed home, right? And so if folks don't like the results from this election, relatively high turnout's fine, but we had a whole bunch of people who chose to sit out, right?
That's right. And that's a record number. If you look at just the gross number, I'm looking at percentages and not because Texas population is booming, of course.
Yeah.
And if some of those numbers differ from what you might have read, most of the press uses a percent of registered voters when they talk about turnout. We're using the voting age population, which is, we think, a better indicator of the health of a democracy because it includes those voters that aren't registered. Because if you're not registered, you're sitting it out, and you're sitting it out too, and it shows just the lack of civic participation from people who are completely legally eligible to vote and just don't even bother to register.
Yeah, so spoiler, if you come to a Texas Impact event over the course of the next few years, odds are high we'll do an exercise where Josh has people stand up and sit down, and we'll see that most of the room was sitting out this election.
Well, and I'm going to keep doing it because if you look at trends, you go back to 2014, it was 25% turnout, and 37% turnout is a heck of a lot better than 25%.
Right.
It may not be the numbers you want, but it's a positive trend line. If you look at primary turnout, it's around 10% of the state, in combining both parties, in around 2014, and it's increased to 13% from that low point, 8-9 years ago. So we're going to keep saying it. We're going to keep saying it because the way it is right now is, the way November came out. And we should note that this was actually an interesting fact here, Scott, and I'm not trying to. This is just a fact. I'm not apologizing for any party here. It was the closest gubernatorial race since 1994 when Ann Richards lost to George W. Bush.
Right.
Now you can put an asterisk. I need to put an asterisk here because 2006 was 10%. But that was a weird four-way race involving Carol Keaton Strayhorn and Kinky Friedman, where Rick Perry defeated Chris Bell by 10 points. So it's a four-way race. So it's the closest two-way race since 1994 when George W. Bush defeated Ann Richards to flip the state. That's just interesting. It's an interesting fact. The turnout is super low in Texas. And while it's improving and while people are getting to work and doing hard work, it still is a problem in Texas.
Yeah, and one that we'll continue to work on, right? So positive steps are good, friends. We've got a lot of work for 2024 and 2026 and 2028. So I'd start thinking now about what else you and your congregation can do to make sure that 11 million number goes down significantly in future elections. That said, we're also continuing to work towards the Texas Legislature. You mentioned that there wasn't much change on the House and Senate side. Anything else stand out to you in those races?
Well, nothing in the races. I know as a staff, I know I have personally made the switch in my head. I have flipped the switch in my head from now that the election is analyzed and we know what it means. We've made the switch to beginning to prep continuing to prep, I should say. We've been prepping, but really the things are coming into focus now. We have a lot of clarity from the election, and we have made the big pivot to thinking about the 88th Legislature, which will convene coming up here in January. Pre-filing of bills started on Monday, and the thing I want to stress to folks is that pre-filing doesn't necessarily increase the likelihood of the bill passing, but what it does reveal is the energy that is felt among the members. And so that pre-filing began on Monday. 1,000 bills dropped. We are still catching up on all of them because 1,000 bills drop, but then it slows down going into the holidays, and so there's plenty of time to catch up on reading those bills. But
I could just see you at the Thanksgiving table, sitting at the Thanksgiving table with bills in your lap. I can just see that going right now.
No, luckily it's all online. I don't have to print those things out unless you. Not too many, don't usually do it unless you just have to. But no, you start filtering those things and seeing what there is. And so we've begun to make that pivot to the 88th. We're on a trajectory for it. The holidays are upon us, and then the legislature's here, and it happens real quick.
Any trends that you're paying attention to coming out of the election as we move into the legislative session?
Yeah. So, it's going to be a tough year on LGBT equality. there was no, the electorate did not send a signal to elected officials to do anything different there. It's going to be a tough year on a number of issues that Texas Impact cares about. One of the things that I want to begin prepping our membership to be on the lookout for, and this is very legally, and the lawyers are going to have to figure out how to message and explain these things to the general public, but private causes of action. In other words, so in the law, you have to have standing to bring a suit, and that is a complicated area of the law of whether or not a person has standing. But one of the ways a person gets standing, and it can be made easier, is if the legislature says, hey, in civil lawsuits over on the judiciary side, you have standing. And the legislature can create lawsuits. They can create the grounds, legal grounds for a lawsuit. And we're beginning to see this trend and to see the civil justice system. So not the criminal side. We bifurcate criminal law and civil law almost everywhere in the United States. On the civil side, where ideological folks want to be able to bring punitive lawsuits on the civil side, where the civil courts are usually meant to be to try to repair a person who's been damaged in some way on account of some other person's negligence. In other words, it wasn't intentional, like a bad car accident or malpractice of a professional. But it's a weaponization of the civil justice system to begin to intimidate people by coming after money. And so we're seeing the legislature make it easier and easier for ideological persons and groups to begin to use these civil lawsuits to punish both companies and individuals. And frankly, it could easily extend to houses of worship. And so this is a trend we need to see. You're seeing it. You saw it already with the passage of Senate Bill 8, which was the so-called heartbeat bill. But the really pernicious part wasn't the heartbeat part of the bill. It was this civil cause of action where ideological actors on abortion could bring punitive lawsuits, frankly, abusive lawsuits, in a court of their choosing anywhere in the state. And these things really put the thumb on the scales of justice and almost rig the civil justice system to favor the ideological plaintiff in these suits. And we're beginning to see the extension of this to things like immunization. It won't surprise me in the legislation for LGBT issues. We're seeing it there. And I think we're going to see this trend of expanding the use of lawsuits to advance an ideological agenda on any number of hot button issues. And this is super problematic for both justice and our society.
I assume also schools will be in focus as we move into the next legislative session.
Oh, yes. That will be probably – so the good news is there's 27 – well, we don't know exactly. The comptroller will come out with a new number in January. But there's a projected very large budget surplus. So we will have money to spend or more likely try to cut property taxes or something along those lines. Is what the current conversation seems to be trending towards. But the other big conversation will be about schools and the so-called culture wars being aimed at our school system. It's really about creating distrust in the public school system so that they can privatize it. Because there are any number of private companies who would love to get their hands on those public funds to run a private school system. And the term for that's vouchers. And so I think that will be one of the big marquee fights of session, and it will not necessarily break on partisan lines at all. In fact, there is a number of it'll be a big division between rural Republicans and suburban Republicans. But also don't neglect a single Democrat, because there are a number of urban Democrats who, and it's not a big number, but when you're counting votes, every vote's important. They have the opinion that, and it's hard to argue with, because they would say since 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, you've never really funded us, and you're not ever going to. You're always going to treat us unequal. So why don't you just give us the money and let us take care of ourselves? They've given up on the public in some ways, and so you have to kind of watch for that, because while it's a sympathetic point of view, it's not the way that we as a larger society want things to go, and we need to figure out the equity issue and not just give up on the public school system, because if we go to a private system, kids will get left behind.
Anything else from the election that you think it's important to highlight?
No, I think that's about it, Scott. I think we've covered it, and I wanted to bring news that you may or may not read in the mainstream press. So that's our unique read on it.
So now that we have analyzed the election, the Texas Legislature is coming in soon, and Texas Impact is going to have a whole lot of opportunities for you to get involved. I'd encourage you right now to go to texasimpact.org and join a team. Encourage your friends to join a team. We have the rapid response team, legislative engagement groups, opportunities for you to engage with other people who care about similar issues as you. So make sure that you are signing up today. Josh, anything else you hope people will be doing over the holidays to prepare for the Texas Legislature?
Yeah, I want to really stress that, we've talked about the election, and that really affects the 25 to 50 very partisan bills that controversial bills that you will hear about in the press. But we should not forget that 7,200 bills get filed every session. Some 1,100 of those 7,200 will likely pass. And boy, 1,100 is a lot bigger than 25 to 50. So that means there's always in any session at least 1,000 or more bills that do not get a whole lot of attention from the general public. And you and as few as 5 people in a House district, for instance, could be influential on how your House member votes on those, 1,000 plus they may be controversial, but not in a partisan way, if that makes sense. In a way that's not getting a whole lot of, they may be controversial only on the inside with the stakeholders. And you're not hearing about it in the press. So that's the reason to join Texas Impact, or any issue organization, is that they want to make you aware of all the things that aren't in the press that you would care about. And they want to get you, and we want to get you involved in being influential on making policy on those 1,000 plus bills that are not getting a whole lot of public attention, but really make an impact on people's lives.
Well, Josh, I really appreciate you taking the time today. I will say during the interim, I sometimes miss you, because during session, I get to put headphones on and talk to you on air like once a week, sometimes more. And I miss that.
Man, yeah. We're going to be seeing a lot more of each other.
We are. So friends, make sure that you're signed up for all the Texas Impact opportunities so you can make sure you stay up to date during the legislative session. That said, I hope everybody has a good holiday season. Find some time now to rest, enjoy company, decompress after the election, have some great turkey or brisket. There was a fierce debate going on social media, Josh, about whether or not turkey or brisket should be the official meat of Thanksgiving. You want to weigh in on that? Or
I mean, yeah, if you're a traditionalist, it's turkey, but I'm not much of a traditionalist. I think brisket sounds delicious, and boy, it is a nice excuse to get out in the backyard and smoke meat.
All right, we're now going to get letters
get out of the house and get out of the way.
We're now going to get emails about that. So thank you, Josh. But again, we hope you all have a safe and wonderful holiday, and that you take that time to rest and come back prepared in the coming weeks to get ready for the legislature coming to Austin. Again, Texas Impact will have opportunities for you and your congregation to get involved. So make sure you're checking texasimpact.org. Check the join a team section. Go ahead and sign up today and make sure your friends are doing the same. Also, as always, make sure that you're sharing this podcast with your friends and congregations. Then head back over to texasimpact.org to make sure that you are a member of Texas Impact to support this important work. Y'all, the election is over, so now is the time for advocates to step up and engage our representatives to create a world that represents a more just and inclusive and loving Texas. The world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnick, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.